Hi, welcome back. We've been having a discussion with Josh Hershberger on religious liberty and the coronavirus. We know there's been a lot of questions that pastors all around the country have been having is how do we balance this delicate tension between protecting the public health of the nation, but also just liberties in general, not just with the church, but businesses are closed, individuals are being prohibited to gathering with large gatherings. You think about the weddings, the funerals, and all the things that we have seen canceled these last few days. So Josh, I really look forward to encouraging and just continuing this discussion with you. So thanks so much for giving us so much time here these last few days.
Well, thanks, Greg, for the opportunity. And I know this is heavy on pastors' hearts. They want to minister to people, but they certainly want to be good stewards of religious freedom as well. So happy to jump on.
It's just an honor to be able to partner here from Iowa and Indiana here together as we continue similar efforts across the board. My question for you today, Josh, is how do you balance this tension between religious liberty and the common good of people's health?
So I'm going to answer this in two ways. The first one is from a legal perspective. The next one would be from a ministry perspective. And so starting with the government perspective, certainly I hear pastors say, look, the First Amendment does not have an asterisk by it. As in you can practice your religious liberty except during a pandemic. And I'm mindful of a quote by Thurgood Marshall, Justice Thurgood Marshall, who said, history teaches that grave events or great threats to liberty often come in times of urgency when constitutional rights seem too extravagant to endure. And he's pointing out that the crisis and the time to be vigilant about religious liberty is during something like a global pandemic. And so we're mindful of that. So there's no asterisk by the First Amendment, but under current case law, the courts have to look at, does the government have a compelling interest? And that is, are you trying to protect public health? And I think as far as compelling interests go, protecting people from a global pandemic is going to be near the top. But then also the government has to narrowly tailor its actions to accomplish that compelling interest. And that's the difficulty with many of the government orders that are vague. Sometimes you have three levels of government that are talking to you. And so certainly some of those orders are subject to challenge. I think a very clear distinction thus far has been drive-in services versus just the broad society-wide mandate to not hold public events over 10. And so when you're trying to balance these things out, you want to look at, are churches being treated differently than similar organizations? And I would point out specifically public assemblies. Under the law, the church is treated as a public assembly. And we could argue about that. I mean, it's not fair for people to go to the grocery store. Don't get me started about government press conferences. They tell everybody, hey, you need to socially distance, and then they're all standing right next to each other. But the legal reality is that churches are treated as public assemblies. And so that's how the law balances these things out. The law says, look, you cannot infringe on religious liberty unless the government has a compelling interest and is acting in a very narrowly tailored way. And to date, that's kind of where the distinctions have fallen. The Kansas Supreme Court has upheld a ban on meetings above 10, whereas a federal judge has struck down a prohibition on drive-in services because, look, lots of other similar businesses are able to have people drive through. So that's the government side. And I've written about this as well, but that's essentially how the government's going to analyze that question. And I think for church leaders, there's another analysis. And I wonder if you've ever noticed a slight tension between the First Amendment and the First Commandment. Now, before you assign me a nickname like Benedict Arnold, or kind of insert your least favorite politician here, please understand that I'm a big fan of the First Amendment. However, the right to speak doesn't necessarily give us much guidance on the right thing to speak. And so our love for God, our focus on the gospel, should inform how and when we pursue religious liberty claims. I think of specifically some conversations I had last week around drive-in services, where pastors said, look, I should have the right, I do have the right to hold a drive-in service. But do I want to make Easter weekend all about my empty parking lot rather than the empty tomb? And I think that was a good question to ask and to wrestle with. Now, I'm glad that the church stepped up and filed that lawsuit, but I think that's a question, a tension that we have to try to manage. I'll say this as we close, and I know, Greg, you talk about this all the time, and I really appreciate it. I hear pastors concerned about politics and Christians being involved in the political firestorms of 2020, and that it's going to jeopardize our gospel witness. And they'll cite the culture wars of the last 30 plus years. Well, now it's our turn. This is the crisis where people are going to look back at and say, how did church leaders lead during this time? Did they jeopardize the gospel in an effort to get their church open a week earlier? Or did they prioritize the gospel and how they responded? So don't hear me to say, don't pursue religious liberty claims. No, do that. But the way that we pursue those claims is important as well. And so how should we balance these things? I've explained the government, but then also as pastors, are we focusing on the Great Commission and prioritizing our public witness as we go about this?
Thank you, Josh. That's some really good insight. And I really just appreciate that challenge of wanting to protect religious liberty, but also keeping in mind our witness as we look at culture around us. And that is a delicate balance, because it is important to maintain religious liberty, to be able to continue to proclaim the gospel, but at the same time, that gospel is compromised. What did we protect? So thank you for those insightful words. And I just want to thank all the pastors around the country who've been stepping up in their communities to meet needs, bring forward the gospel. We just had an Easter that probably had the most people any time in human history. They got to hear the gospel because of all the broadcasts that you all tirelessly put efforts into. So thanks for the insight today, Josh, and thank you for everyone that's watching this video. I encourage you to continue to watch this series as we continue to unpack this really good information from Josh Hershberger.